much indeed. Right, it's time to move on. It's time now for Head to Head.
Head to Head.
Well, joining us this morning is Portia Berry-Kilby, who is a political commentator. Also joining her is Luke Hildyard, who is CEO of the High Pay Centre. Good morning to the two of you.
Morning.
I'm deeply upset that you're not here, by the way, but thank you very much indeed for joining us, nonetheless. Let's talk about Chester, shall we? This by-election, Portia. This really extraordinary, well, not extraordinary win, but a win for Labour with this change of, 13.8% swing from Tory to Labour. This is Samantha Dixon who retained the seat for her party. What does it say about the state of the Tory party, Portia?
Well, I don't think it's exactly the greatest news to be rejoicing at. But at the end of the day, the polls had an extra 4% swing to Labour. They didn't deliver on that. That's not to say that the Tories are doing marvellously, but it's kind of expectations can be managed. It's more or less as expected, but not such the hammering as they thought it was. And they made 20% of the vote. That's got to be an extra boost to them to think they've not entirely lost the game.
So are you trying to say it was a good result for the Conservatives?
Not at all, but at least it's not as bad as it could have been. And at this point, any extra 2 or 3% will be a sufficient hope, I think, for them.
I love your optimism. I mean, I have to say.
I think that's fair. But at the end of the day, like, if Labour despite everything that's gone on the past 2 years, if Labour is still falling slightly short of what they were projected, then that's got to be some food for thought. And it's not just necessarily going to spell a Labour landslide. There could be more of a fudge of a coalition of some sorts down the line at the next election. And it also it does show that the Conservatives have some wriggle room. And at the point when, like, every seat is basically on the line, a few percent one way or the other is what is needed at the end of the day.
So Luke, what's your reading of the Chester by-election? And Portia puts a very good sort of gloss on that. But my feeling is that actually, and clearly, and we can talk about this, but also all of these Conservative MPs and Labour actually standing down now, 2 years out of a general election. What's your view about the current state of British politics?
Well, I think people standing down, particularly the Tory MPs, reflect their view of what's going to happen in the next election. And the polls show, and the Chester result suggests, though, as Portia suggests, it wasn't, quite as huge a massive swing to Labour as was projected, but it was a huge, massive swing that was being projected, and it was still a big swing. That happened, falling sort of slightly short of more massive than of being as massive as people were saying. I think the key thing is, if you look at the opinion polls, you look at the Chester result, Labour has the kind of lead in opposition at this stage of the Parliament that opposition leaders who went on to win the next election, like Blair and Cameron had. They're a long way ahead of opposition leaders like Miliband or Corbyn, who had leads mid-term, as opposition parties often do, but not big enough ones to sustain when those leads narrowed, again, as they inevitably do. So I think it will be, the next election will be far closer than the opinion polls are suggesting. But at the moment, you'd say Labour is on course to win based on historical precedent.
I mean, that's quite interesting, Luke. I mean, Professor Sir John Curtis, who we spoke to just a minute ago, said that actually Labour has a big mountain to climb, Portia, that even with this kind of swing, they would only just win. They would just win with a few seats. And maybe your idea that Labour would have the most seats but actually not have an overall majority may well be the outcome of the next election. Although the other thing is that when you look at this YouGov poll, which I mentioned earlier, the fact is you've now got in third position, tied at the moment, Reform UK and the Lib Dems. So people are deserting the Conservative Party and looking elsewhere.
I think that's very fair. And I think, as you referenced, the numerous MPs who have already announced that they're standing down is only going to add to those other parties actually making a headway, because you don't have that incumbency advantage. And that can lend a few votes to you. And when it is so tight and people are so fed up of just the usual political players, they're going to be turning to other parties, probably more so if their favoured guy or lady, we should say, isn't freestanding for election.
And Luke, just from your experience, what are the issues that most affect people in this country? People tend to vote with their feet. What are the issues, do you think, that will define this election?
Well, I think the economy, cost of living, public services are the obvious ones. Right now, you try and get a GP appointment, it's nearly impossible. You go to A&E, you're waiting for hours and hours. If you experience any kind of minor crime, somebody I know had all the tools nicked from their van recently, and that kind of crime has basically been legalised because the police don't have the resources to deal with it. I think those kind of quality of life, public service issues, people are really feeling them very strongly at the moment, that costs are getting out of control, public services aren't working, and there's just a general kind of sense of chaos, inertia, drift on part of the government. And I think that that just sense of things failing is really going to be on voters' minds when they go into the ballot, into the booth to mark their crosses.
And what about immigration?
I think not so much. I think the polls tend to be showing that public services and the economy are higher priority issues for people. I don't think, employment levels are strong at the moment. I don't think people feel that immigrants are stopping other people from getting a job. Quite the opposite. In fact, we've got employment shortages in a lot of industries. So I think that the people recognise that we need some level of immigration into this country. We've got an ageing population, and that sort of young blood to sort of supplement that is necessary and helpful for the economy and for our public services. Immigrants tend to pay more tax than they consume in public services. And when you look at the state of our public services at the moment, that's very definitely needed.
Well, you say that, but of course the thing is, I'm talking about not only legal immigration, but illegal immigration. And the problem is that you can also bring family members here if you come on a student visa. For example, they overstay their visas. We can't actually then work out how many school places we need or hospitals. So let me ask you, Portia, immigration, do you think it plays a big role or will play a big role? Illegal immigration will play a big role in the next general election?
I think it always has and always will until it's actually properly managed. And especially, as Luke said, when people are concerned about the cost of living, if that's not going well, you're going to blame that on someone. And it's easy to blame it on the government, but it's also easy, rightly or wrongly, to blame it on illegal immigration if they're receiving some form of support from the government, or that's just perceived to be advancing in some way that you're not as a hard-working person. Then, of course, there's going to be greater clamour for illegal immigration to be stopped, and there always has been. And when there's not the track record to show that progressing and that being properly managed, then of course it's just going to become seemingly more of a problem.
Let me move on to something else, if I may, Luke, which is about the war on woke culture. There's a free speech law which is designed to prevent universities from cancelling controversial speakers. It's been watered down. Many people in this country are now so frightened about what they can and can't say, and feel that actually the thought police are out there to get them the whole time. Do you think actually we've become really intolerant to people expressing their own opinions?
I mean, I always sort of struggle with this stuff. I certainly don't know anybody who feels they can't say what they want to say, and that any kind of thought police are going to get them. Maybe, maybe people do feel like that, and I, never seek to denigrate anybody's opinions. But I find it a kind of a massive distraction, really. The stuff about who is and isn't allowed to speak at university. Of course, people of differing views should be allowed to speak at universities or elsewhere. But as one of the kind of major issues facing the country, like arguments about speakers at student unions, it just sort of seems crazy to me that we give this any time. I don't think there's, I think there's just so many bigger issues we're facing. I'd say, possibly that's a sort of reflection of the people I talk to, but I just don't feel, anybody, my friends in London, my family at home in Yorkshire and in the West Country, nobody ever sort of says to me that they feel they can't, say what they think, or that the thought police are out to get them. Maybe it's just something I'm missing.
Right, Portia, I mean, clearly universities are the hotbed of this, and there are multiple cases of people who've been no platform by universities, and this law was intended to ensure that universities can't deplatform people. What's your view on that?
I think maybe Luke should look towards the palace, and you've got Lady Percy, who's been deplatformed after 60 years of service, and all she was asking was a series of questions. If someone asked me where I was from and I gave the name of a charity and as to where I'm actually from, and I think that, if you can't recognise that as someone being deplatformed, basically cancel culture at play for something that maybe wasn't sensitively phrased, but at the same time wasn't really intending to cause any offence. And that's at the palace and at the highest levels, and the palace administration then deciding that, she should basically stand down or resign, I think is a concern. And at universities as well, I think this is a time when you have impressionable aged children, young adults, we probably say, and if they can't get two sides of an argument, then you're just causing problems for the country down the line, let alone the individual people. But you're going to have a whole generations of people who can't think for themselves, who can't critically analyse an argument, and then you just get even more shut down of opposition.
I mean, it's a great point, Portia, about Lady Susan Hussey. Luke, let me ask you that. I mean, you weren't there, I wasn't there, but this is an 83-year-old lady. There is an entire transcript that's appeared from this conversation, which I find extraordinary in the first instance. Also, the lady in question, Ngozi Fulani, was wearing traditional dress. So, therefore, she was asked a question, where are you from? Which I think, and I keep saying, was about intent. That's what I mean about not being able just to say what you think. Does that concern you?
I mean, it was. I think the dialogue that's been reported was very clumsy, and it's certainly not a way I would address anyone.
I would agree with that.
I think. I think it's certainly not the right way to speak to anyone, regardless of their their background. And to me, it's a slight sign of how far removed from the real world a lot of people in these very rich aristocratic circles are.
But she's also 83.
I do agree that it hasn't been handled very well. I don't think she should have been. I don't think this should have been done in public. I do feel sorry for her as an old woman who's having her name in the press, traduced on social media and whatnot. I don't think that was done in the right way at all. I think it was very, it was a pretty sort of clumsy blunder on her part. I can see why Ngozi Fulani was put out by it. I don't think trashing the Susan Hussey in public and putting her through all this was quite the right thing to do either. I do, of course, agree with that.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. May I just move on now to the nurses' strike? I mean, we've now heard that the nurses' strike is taking place on the 16th. Oh, no, so this is on the 15th and 20th of December. I was staggered this morning when I read that actually cancer wards will not be excluded, emergency medicine, A&E will not be excluded, maternity wards will not be excluded. The nurses want 19.2%. Wes Streeting says that's not possible for the Labour Party. Obviously, we've heard from Rishi Sunak. He says that's not possible too. And Portia, what is this going to do to the perception of nurses when they abandon accident and emergency, abandon people with cancer and abandon pregnant women?
Yeah, I think that ultimately you'll have two camps. You'll have one camp which blames the government and has full sympathy for the nurses, but then the other that even if they do blame the government partly for this, they'll think, hang on, you're asking for a huge increase. And the idea that yourself, your family, a friend, could be a pregnant woman, could be a patient with cancer, having treatment potentially cancelled, or just turning up to A&E and not being seen, you're not going to have any sympathy for them down the line. And there's already kind of faith in the NHS is kind of at a record low. That's not exactly going to help it improve when you have nurses adding to waiting times, adding to not being able to actually get treatment when you need it. They're there to offer a service. And if you're abandoning people literally in that hour of need, then I don't think you're exactly going to carry favour.
So, Luke, you're the chief executive of the High Pay Centre. I think all of us believe that nurses should be paid more because, of course, they've seen real terms decline in their salaries. But you mentioned earlier with Susan Hussey it wasn't the best way to go about things. Is that the case here as well?
Well, I mean, I think it's legitimate for people as a last resort who are negotiating a pay rise to use strike action. My understanding is that anything sort of life-saving or life-threatening will still go ahead. They're required by law to people doing that kind of work not to go on strike. That's my understanding of it.
Well, my understanding is, they said, I've got Dr. Rennie with me as well. I mean, my understanding, I don't know if we can bring you in, but my understanding is that emergency services are not protected by this.
And I think initially we thought that they were going to be protected, but it seems today from the stories that they're actually not even going to be in A&E. And the point is, Luke, that, you know, if somebody's in an ambulance in a life-threatening situation outside but can't actually get into the hospital because there are no nurses, then they're not being seen to.
Luke?
Right. Well, I'm going on what's been reported around the life-saving treatments. I think the key point is, over the long term, if we can't attract and retain nurses and other medical staff for the NHS, if they're continually their paying conditions are getting worse and worse, they're becoming more and more demoralised, that's going to be a much bigger threat to people's well-being than a one-day strike. Again, I do, you know, of course, people are going to be terrified by the sound of the thought of the NHS shutting down or running a skeleton service this close to Christmas. But we should also look at the bigger picture as well. We should totally look at the bigger picture, Luke. I agree. I couldn't agree more with you. And I think morale is at an all-time low. But giving the nurses a 19% pay rise in the middle of winter when they go on strike just as we approach Christmas is not going to change that. What's going to change that is wholesale reform of the NHS and a plan which goes over the next 10 to 15 years. Well, I don't know. I would say that if your pay has been deteriorating for a long time, if you're wanting your pay to at least keep up with the cost of living now, I think that would be a very good way of raising morale, attracting and retaining more people in the sector, and thus improving the quality of the quality of care. And I think it's important to say just on the funding of all this, and this is a point for both parties, not party political point. Lots of people, lots of very well informed academic experts in the run up to the recent budget were talking about ways in which you could raise extra money for public services, whether you spend it on nurses' pay or whatever, from things like wealth taxes on the super rich, equalising the tax rate that people pay on income from capital gains with the tax rate that those of us who work for a living pay on our income. That would have raised tens of billions of pounds from people who would still be very rich even after paying that little bit of extra tax, and that would make things a little easier for our public services. So I think there's a lot to consider here. We should be sort of seeing the bigger picture. Though of course I sympathise with those who feel worried by the sound of the NHS running a skeleton service at the height of winter.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for joining us this morning. That's Portia Berry-Kilby, political commentator, and Luke Hildyard, who is CEO of the High Pay Centre. And that was, of course, today's Head to Head.
Head to Head.